It seems everywhere you go right now, people are complaining about the demise of media as we know it, the rise of startups, the disruption of legacy models for maintaining fiscal profitability. But what if one concern addressed could be a solution for all of this? Michael Deas will explore how diversity as a business model just may be the solution.
Do we think that newsrooms reflect the people they serve? Newsrooms that responded to the American Society of News Editors survey say that 88% of newsrooms are white, 12% are non-white. How many of you think that 88 to 12 is a fair cut of the pie? Okay. Well, it's not. All right? It's a far cry from equal in any equation. Not only is it not fair in terms of voice, story choices, representations, and editorial decisions, it's not a smart business model. What can we do about that? What can we do about that? Well, I propose that we approach diversity as a tool for building our market value, our market share. Despite America's rapidly changing racial and ethnic makeup, news organizations are becoming increasingly homogeneous at the expense of diversity and stability. There are 38,000 journalists at 1,400 U.S. newspapers. Only 4,500 are minorities, an average of 3 per newsroom. Just to provide additional context, out of 38,000 journalists, 1,800 are black, 1,600 are Hispanic, 1,100 Asians, 140 Native Americans, and 100 multiracial as described under a new census category. Companies such as Gannett, Tribune, and New York Times continue to see their readership shrink while the population increases and diversifies. These organizations are marginalizing themselves by producing content that often lacks accuracy on topics such as jobs, immigration, poverty, and crime. What do we lose when everyone in the newsroom looks the same, regardless of race or ethnicity? We lose depth and perspective. Pulitzer Prize-winning projects such as the Akron Beacon Journal's examination of racial attitudes and the New York Times coverage of the Tiananmen Square protests would have lacked credibility if journalists of color were excluded from the process. As an educator and editor for more than 20 years, I'm concerned that newsrooms that exclude people of different persuasions will eventually render themselves irrelevant, as well as hamper rational public discourse. Remember Trayvon Martin? How about the Gina 6? Cases such as George Zimmerman and the Gina 6 illustrate the industry's inability to credibly cover stories fraught with racial and cultural overtones. the misguided reporting on the shooting death of an unarmed black teen by a Hispanic neighborhood watch officer or volunteer was fueled mostly by ignorance as opposed to intelligence. Besides raising the consciousness of newsrooms, diverse staffs provide access to communities typically wary of outsiders. In the 1960s, newspapers hired scores of black journalists to cover the complexities of their communities that white journalists could not do because they would risk their lives. In the case of 6 black youths, controversially prosecuted for the attempted murder of a student involved in a noose hanging incident, the mainstream media initially ignored the story while it simmered on the blogs for months before a Chicago Tribune reporter, Howard Witt, wrote about it. Imagine a company like McDonald's employing one sector of society and selling food to only one niche who would eat it. What do you think that will amount to? It will amount to financial suicide. Also imagine a giant retailer such as Walmart or Kmart employing and catering to one segment of our culture. Just think about these 2 examples for a minute. Think about them. This is the mistake that news organizations make every single day. Every single day. To establish a viable business model, we must address the issues of diversity and declining ad revenue with fervency and urgency. To their detriment, newsrooms have pushed off their agendas any efforts to hire, retain, or promote journalists of color, as evidenced by the disproportionate layoffs of minorities since 2006. Now, only a small fraction of minority journalists work in roles or positions of leadership. Here's some details. Minority journalists fill roughly 900 managerial jobs compared to 9,000 for white journalists. Many minority journalists serve as figureheads who wield very little or no influence whatsoever. As newsrooms fight to survive their new economic reality, executives and experts have primarily focused on marketing and innovation as possible solutions. Meanwhile, they ignore the need for newsroom diversity. Since the number of minorities in newsrooms peaked at 7,500 nearly a decade ago, that number has dropped precipitously, heading in the opposite direction of a rapidly changing society. Even though a Pew Research report in 2013 found that 60% of the readers think that news outlets no longer serve their needs, it failed to address the issue from the standpoint of diversity. Now, how that breaks down along racial and ethnic lines, we still have no idea. Since the Readership Institute at Northwestern University surveyed 37,000 readers about their news consumption habits, no one has followed suit since, which, in my opinion, is the large part of the problem. For several years, journalists and academics have struggled to find ways to connect with the audience. However, they're ignoring or they're not addressing the lack of decision makers of color. And we wonder why we're having difficulty connecting with the audience. When newsrooms do not reflect society as a whole, it's understandable and it should be expected that consumers, regardless of race or ethnicity, will gravitate to media that address their concerns. Only Milton Coleman, senior editor at the Washington Post and former president of the the American Society of News Editors, has recently broached this topic from a revenue perspective. You know, as circulation and advertising revenue continue to decline, news operations or news organizations are missing out on a golden opportunity to attract diverse consumers. The buying power of these groups is simply staggering. According to a multicultural economy report, Hispanics or Latinos command $1.2 trillion. African Americans, $1 trillion. Asians, $700 billion, just shy of $1 trillion. Native Americans, $96 billion in consumer spending. If those numbers are not sobering enough, Pew predicts that 1 in 5 Americans would be an immigrant within the next 3 decades. The Latino population, currently at 16%, is expected to triple by 2050. I also must add that the Latino market is reported to be larger than the entire economies of all but 13 countries in the world. Can you imagine that? What a motivating forecast and encouraging message that should drive us, or it should inspire us to strive for the highest excellence of journalistic character and professionalism. In a utopia, all things are equal. In media, the solutions are clear. Now, if we move toward that end, I'm confident that we will achieve excellence and fairness for everyone. Readers, journalists, advertisers, all right? Here are some suggestions on how to get the ball rolling on diversifying newsrooms and meeting the bottom line. First, dispense with the lame excuse that there aren't any qualified minorities. It's disingenuous and it's insulting to every intelligent and fair-minded person. 2, hire editorial and advertising professionals who reflect society as a whole. And by no means am I talking about an exercise of window dressing. 3, hire minority journalists for leadership jobs immediately and support them and promote them and fairly pay them for a job well done as we would anyone else. 4th, start recognizing journalists of color as contributors to the larger discussion, such as global affairs, national security, economics, science. Also, don't assume that African American journalists can only speak or write authoritatively about Africa or urban affairs, or that a Latino can only cover issues on immigration. And finally, let's educate college students about diversity across all disciplines. And I also challenge journalism schools, like news organizations, to dispense with the lip service and lead the charge by example. Because our survival depends on it. We're all in this together. All right? As you can see, it doesn't make any sense to call a distribution of 8812 fair by any stretch of the imagination. And it doesn't make dollars or cents. Thank you.